So you're very welcome. It's great to be here. It's a pleasure to be speaking with my colleague Kat Porter from the University of Limerick. Kat and I have been working together for, we were just saying, for possibly around about 15 years now. And over that time, we've worked on a variety of different projects, some on Ireland, some on other places as well. But at the heart of our work has been an interest in maps and map making. And I suppose tonight, really, what we're doing is drawing upon some of that work, which we've been engaging with, collaborating on for those years, and drawing as well on the cartographic collections of the Armagh Robinson Library, which I think is an important dimension to the talk and to the lecture. So the title, as you can see, is A Journey Through Maps, Exploring Ireland's Cartographic Heritage. So we are embarking on, I suppose, a journey which is a chronological journey, as you'll see soon, a journey through time, but also a journey through space as well, engaging with different maps and different cartographers around the island. But the kind of common thread to all of this is an interest between us in the Ordnance Survey of Ireland, and also the importance of the Ordnance Survey to us at the moment, as because we're working on a project funded by the Irish Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, a collaborative project on the Ordnance Survey in Ireland, and marking the bicentenary of the OS in Ireland in 2024. So we're going to end on that kind of story, but we're going to take it, sort of wind you back, if you like, to the beginning really with this. And I'm going to say a few words to begin with, to start the talk, some sort of context and background, and then Kat will take over, and then Kat will hand back to me, and we'll hopefully, all being well, be wrapping up in about 40 to 50 minutes or so, and have some time at the end for questions, which we'll be really interested to get from you. So here we go. Right. So maybe Kat, you could, Kat's in control of the slides. So thank you for that. Right, so our journey then is also a journey which involves really thinking critically about maps and map making. And I wanted to sort of start with this, I'm just going to move the little thing out of the way, with this thought really about looking behind the map, which is really what we're trying to do with all of the talk this evening, is to think not just about the map image, but about what actually lies behind the map that we see, that we often sort of valorize, fetishize, the thing that we hang on our wall, the thing we might visit the library to see, the map itself, and all the interesting things that the map might show. But the map really, in many ways, is an end product of lots of decision-making and activities and so on. And what we, Kat and I, are interested in is thinking through the map, looking behind the map to the field, to the landscape, to the place really where a map is really made, at least initially through field survey. But as another way of thinking about looking behind the map, and I'm drawing here on the work of a really important and influential historian of maps and map making, J.B. Harley, Brian Harley, who wrote a really important article. He was a historical geographer, and he died in really, well, about the early 1990s, I think it was, quite a while ago now. But one influential paper which really got, I think, a lot of us thinking more critically about maps, and especially about how maps are made, and how maps are, as he says here, not value-free images. In other words, maps say a lot about those who made them, and they also say a lot about the processes, the decision-making that went into map making, the selectivity, as Harley says here, the selectivity in their content, in how maps represent, and so on. These are all a reflection of what he calls particular sets of social relations. So maps themselves are culturally embedded. They are to be situated, to put in their place, if you like, to think about who made them, why they were made, when they were made, and these sorts of questions. questions of authority and of authorship. So this is what Brian Harley was leading us to think about 20, 30 years ago, looking behind the map, or thinking critically about the map, which is important and is still very influential to us today as historical geographers. So Kat, maybe the next slide. Kat and I have been thinking about looking behind the map in a kind of complementary way, but in a way which really has not, we would suggest, perhaps had as much attention given to it as it ought to have. And that's really to take the map from looking at the map as an image to thinking about the map as a product from survey, from the field. And our cartographic journey this evening is looking behind the map, but looking behind the map through this cartographic journey from field to map, to think about those survey practices which were important in shaping the gathering of information, which then becomes important, obviously, in the representation of a landscape, a town, or whatever it might be, a piece of country on a particular map. So what we have here is an image, and it's fairly widely used, actually, often as a book cover. And I'd be very interested if anybody knows in the room this evening, if anybody can guide me to where the original of this image here, the Royal Sappers and Miners, 1837, is well used, especially in Ireland, as an image of the Ordnance Survey surveyors in the field. And you can see they're dressed in all their finery. The men there in the background, you have two chaps with their theodolites on a tripod, taking a reading across to the beacon, situated on a hill on the other side of the valley there. And below the beacon is the camp, one of Colby's camps, the surveyors camped out there. And one might imagine this is a view of some part of Ireland, perhaps, where the surveyors are roaming and surveying, gathering information from the field. So this is what's going on behind the map. When we see the final map, an Ordnance Survey 6-inch map, for example, of Ireland, we have to think really of these characters, those individuals in the field, and what they're doing on the ground. So from field to map is an important part of our cartographic journey. But we also want to think a bit about the journey from map to field. And that's something which we will be looking at, Kat and I, tonight, because often, so often, the map making process is not, especially in more distant times, not especially well documented. And indeed, the map often is the only evidence we have of the survey process. So how can we begin to use a map, which is the final product, to reverse engineer from the map to those field practices, to the survey practices, to what life was like in the field? So that's something else we want to try and do on our cartographic journey tonight. Remind ourselves of this journey from field to map, as I've just been saying, but also think about how we can go from the map back into the field and use the map as a way of unlocking the secrets, if you like, of those processes and practices that shaped it and formed it on the ground in the field in times past. Next slide, please, Kat. So here is this is actually where I'm speaking from now, Bangor, County Down, Northern Ireland, the second edition Ordnance Survey 6-inch sheet for this particular part of the world. And it's just, I wanted to include this really because the map itself has traces in it, embedded in it. The Ordnance Survey 6-inch map is a good example of this. Somebody's popping some things into the chat, which is great. So the Ordnance Survey maps, like these 6-inch maps, contain the traces of those surveyors on the ground. We need to perhaps, look at some of the evidence for that in our journey, in our cartographic journey. And we can see them here around Sea View in the top left-hand corner of the map. The dots there with the points and the figures, the elevations, indicating at traverse, that line through the landscape, a chaining line from the trigonometrical station, which you can see marked as the triangle with the dot, that classic symbol for trigonometrical station on the Ordnance Survey map there. So we can begin to trace and retrace the activities of the surveyors through the maps themselves. This is just one example. But what we'll be doing through the course of this talk is actually digging more deeply through these maps, these historic maps we've got for you this evening, and thinking about these surveying practices, trying to take us back into the field through the map. Okay, next slide, please. Kat, right, so this is more or less where I begin to hand over to Kat, but one of the things relating to the Ordnance Survey, I mentioned this Ordnance Survey, the OS 200 project, the bicentenary of the Ordnance Survey in Ireland. And one of the legacies of the Ordnance Survey, as well as the 6-inch sheets, which of course we are very familiar with, are these facsimiles, copies of which are also available in the Robinson Library in Armagh, as well as at Queen's University Belfast. The Ordnance Survey in Ireland is not just about creating new maps, but creating facsimiles of historic maps, maps of the Escheated Counties in Ireland, well studied, in fact, by John Andrews. And actually referring to John Andrews, as you know, John Andrews wrote this amazing book called A Paper Landscape. And the reason we have these facsimiles is down to one of the superintendents of the Ordnance Survey, who was very important to us in Ireland, as well as in GB in Great Britain as well. And this is Henry James. And Henry James was responsible really for promoting a particular way of reproducing and printing through photographic means historic maps, including the maps of the Escheated Counties in Ireland, which is what we're looking at here, these facsimiles. And if you look actually at the bottom part of that cover page, you'll see it says Sir Henry James. So what John Andrews tells us about James, he says, had spent many years in command of a survey division before joining and later directing the geological branch of the Irish Survey, a task that kept him in the country with Larkham and Leach after all the other officers had left. And everyone admitted James's ability, but in the dedicated inner circle of the Irish Survey's well-wishers, he was felt to be vain, selfish, and shallow. That's something about the man. But what about these maps? What about the maps we're looking at here? Can we have the next slide, please, Kat? So the maps that James was reprinting or publishing in the 1850s and 1860s, it was in many ways a really important image or part of the imaging of Ireland, which can be traced back before, well before the Ordnance Survey, of course, and right the way back to the time that of Josias Bodley and Bartlett, which were the cartographers that James was interested in that volume, in that facsimile we were just looking at, to earlier times. And we can begin to trace a genealogy, a lineage, if you like, of maps and map making in Ireland, which connects from one to the other. And this is something that Kat and I have been thinking about and working on, this cartographic lineage or heritage, and the influences of one map maker on another map maker and on another map maker and so forth. Map makers are great plagiarists, or compilers would perhaps be more generous, borrowing from each other over time. And we can begin to trace the origins, the lineages of those later map makers in the map images from earlier times. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Kat, and what Kat will be doing is tracing through this story, the early mapping of Ireland, in particular picking up on the facsimiles of Henry James, which I've just mentioned, and digging a little bit more deeply into this idea that the map itself can unlock to us, unlock for us, those field practices, those surveying activities in the field embedded in our maps. So, Kat, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Keith, and thanks, Robert, for having us along today. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk to such a broad audience, because I understand we have people from all over the world, so it's great to have everybody in the same room, as it were, to hear us speak this evening. So as Keith was saying, really here with this slide, we're taking you back then through that cartographic heritage of the island. And here we're actually considering some of the earliest extant maps of Ireland. Here you can see that the information displayed on the maps of Ireland, but other places as well, these sorts of maps, it was derived from a variety of sources, and the maps, of course, were created for varying purposes as well. So sometimes they were exercises in power and planning. Sometimes they were used for flattery, maybe of a commissioner or someone in charge. Often they were drawn from personal experience and travel, maybe sketches of what someone remembered or actually chose to record, depending on their interests or their agenda, for instance, as well. But the complexity of these maps that you can see on screen at the moment is heightened when we consider that they include a lot of detail that's been sourced from secondhand knowledge. So maybe through hearsay or existing written texts, and all too frequently by someone who'd never actually visited the place that they were portraying on the cartography. Now for Ireland, of course, we have a wealth of extant maps from the 16th century onwards that really chart this changing shape of the island, as Keith was saying, and each of these had a differing focus and agenda. Sometimes we don't know what that was, though, and in many cases we don't know, as I say, why the map was made, by whom it was commissioned, the sources that were used to construct it. And certainly in the case of these earlier maps that you can see here on screen, survey was not involved at all. So the one that you can see on the left of your screen here, called the unnamed map of Ireland, it's extant in the British Library, and it's actually the earliest depiction of Ireland that we have as a solo entity. And then we're moving a little bit through time from the 1530s into the 1550s. We have a sketch that was annotated by Cecil in the centre there. And then slightly later, moving into the 1560s, late 1560s, a map of Hibernia by a man named John Gough. So we have a real, you can see this changing shape of Ireland sort of being liberated across these different sort of maps and time period. But then in the mid to late 16th century, the English Crown began a different type of mapping in Ireland. And this mapping moved away from this sort of visual depiction of the island to a more complex geographical view that was derived from survey. And of course, this was deemed a requirement in terms of their plans for plantation. And on the screen here, you can see two maps. The first that you can see up at the top left is a map that has been attributed by John Andrews again to a Robert Lythe from a survey that was completed between 1567 and 1570. In the centre, you can see the general description of Ulster. This was a survey by Richard Bartlett in 1603. And at the top right, you can see lastly what is a barony map, which is part of these confiscated maps that Keith mentioned earlier. There are 28 of these maps extant that cover these Escheated maps of Ulster. They date to 1609. Now, of course, there were lots of other maps that came in between these, but we've just had to take a small selection today to concentrate on in this talk. And we know, of course, that from documentary evidence that all of these maps were derived from survey. So that makes them straight away quite different to the maps that I showed you on the previous screen. But as Keith was saying, we really don't have any or very little record of how the surveying was carried out to actually create these maps. Something that, of course, isn't uncommon to contemporary surveying across the Western world and beyond. But we also have very little knowledge about the tools and the methods, the skill set of the people involved. In some cases, still, we don't even know who they were necessarily as well. Now, of course, sometimes we can gain some snippets of information from written records, so things like the state papers, maybe correspondence between the field agents, so those surveyors out in the field with their line managers, as it were, in maybe London or Dublin. But aside from that, we really don't have very much information. So Keith and I have been thinking about ways in which we might be able to explore, as he was saying, what's actually going on behind the maps, to learn more about these map making processes and practices. And we ask ourselves really what the map can tell us about its construction and its creation. So in particular, thinking here about the surveying practices that were used to collect the information which then appears on that end product on the map itself. And we are doing this by combining archival research, of course, with digital technologies. and through something what Hessler actually terms an inversion of the historical or the standard historical methodology. So we're beginning with the map, and we're actually working backwards through that map making process to the field. So we're asking the map what it can tell us about its creation. And one way that we can access and explore this field information is by harnessing digital technologies. And I mean specifically here, geographic information systems or GIS. And this evening, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what we've been doing with some of these maps and how we've been applying GIS. So we just have a couple of case studies that I'll work through here. So the first of these is the map I mentioned on the earlier screen. This is dated to circa 1571. It's extant at Petworth House Archive in Sussex. And it's this map that has been attributed to Robert Lythe. So Robert was an English Crown employee. He is known from the extant documentary evidence and other map and plan evidence as well, that he visited Ireland. So he was definitely there, and he definitely surveyed the island between 1567 and 1571. Now, detail of the purpose of the venture is really for another time, but very basically in the 1560s, he was tasked with surveying Ulster, and that was at the Queen's directive, Elizabeth I, and then the rest of Ireland as well by Sir Henry Sidney. So he had quite a task on his hands. From correspondence, we know some things about this mapping project. Unlike many contemporary cartographers, as I said, Lythe actually did visit Ireland. He did traverse the land. From his petitions and his charges, which were sent in 1571, we also know that he, for instance, hired local guides to help him navigate, and also some equipment to assist with his work. We also have a little bit of detail from him and others on some of the places that he visited. So this again is recorded in some of his letters and also in his later petitions as well. And we also know that he faced a lot of struggles on this survey as well. He records, for instance, having travelled a long way on foot, that he lost a lot of his horses due to lack of nourishment, and of course the challenging landscape. And his time in Ireland, actually by the end of it, rendered him lame and blind. There were parts of the island also that were within his remit, but that he couldn't visit due to ongoing rebellion as well. So there were a lot of challenges involved in this survey. But aside from a few sort of small mentions in relation to field practice, we don't really know all that much about what went on, what sort of practices he included in this survey. You can see in this short excerpt here a letter that he wrote to Burghley in 1571. He's talking about taking the true bounds and limits of provinces and shires to his best knowledge and judgment. But we don't really get much more information than that in terms of how he actually created this map. So this is really where GIS comes in, and we are here really thinking about how we can use modern mapping software to trace back in time from the map to the field. So this is really the first step. I just wanted to show you the process so that makes sense as well. Here you can see the high resolution copy of the image itself being imported into the GIS software. And you can see these measurements that are marked here on the screen as well. And what we're really doing here is telling the software the exact dimensions of this map in reality. So what you are getting here within the software is a replica, a digital replica of the map itself. It's not the same as some of the sort of geo-rectification or geo-referencing that you would see in other historic map projects, where maybe the map would be warped or twisted in certain ways to fit with other more modern landscapes. This is an absolute digital replica that we're working with here. Following this, we start to digitize some of the features of interest on the map. Now, depending on the project, this could be the coastline, it could be the rivers, lakes, lochs, or in this case, as you can see on the screen, the places that are marked on the map. So each of these become digital layers or vectors within the GIS software. Now, for instance, by doing this, digitising the coastline, for instance, we can do some visual comparison initially. So here we're able to compare the outline of Louth's map of Ireland with a modern outline of Ireland. So you can see the modern outline here in red and Louth's in black. And overall, looking at this, you might actually be quite surprised how well Louth's outline matches the coastline of the island, but immediately noticeable as well are some portions of the map that actually appear to distend, exaggerate in places, reduce in others, and also actually contort the shape of the island a little bit as well. And we can also see quite clearly that there are some clear omissions from the map, mainly Ulster, but in the north and in the west as well. These are places that Louth didn't visit on his survey. So this is a very useful visualization for us, but it doesn't really provide us with any in-depth information or detail on the survey itself. We are looking more at sort of trying to quantify some of the detail on these maps. For instance, how do we know that Louth even visited some of the parts of the map that he included here? So we need to think about other ways that we might be able to investigate that. And one way that we can do that is by returning to this place layer. So we've digitized all of the places that Louth included on the map. Of course, in terms of place, and when you're thinking about place and survey, place is incredibly important. So we have places signified in the landscape with ecclesiastical buildings and towers and castles and mountains and hills. All of these, of course, key if measurement is to be involved in early survey. And of course, we have evidence of this from some of Louth's contemporaries, people such as Christopher Saxton, for instance, as well. And so to expand on this place layer, we need to collect some information about it. So the first thing we do, and you can see this in the attached attribute table on the screen here as well, we start to collect place name information. And the one that I've highlighted here is for Dingle. So you can see a column in that table that shows the historic name on the Louth map, and another column that shows the modern place name equivalent. And in addition to that, we also start to collect coordinate information. So we have the what we would call here the modern coordinate information in Irish Transverse Mercator. It's in meters for the place of Dingle, but then a second set of coordinate information that actually comes in centimeters from this historic map. And it's these two sets of coordinates that provide the basis for the analysis that I'm going to explain next. This allows us to do a relative comparison of place between the historic and the modern. So the first thing that we can do then with that digitized place layer, as I said, is start to look at how well cited the places on the historic map are. This might tell us something about accuracy, yes, okay, but also about the survey process as well. And we can actually begin to calculate relative distance between the place as it is cited on the historic map and the same place on the modern map, using something that you can see here on screen, these sort of lines here. These are called directional displacement vectors. And they're actually a function of an open source piece of software that any of us can use, but they're based on quite a complex form of regression called bidimensional regression. Ordinarily, bidimensional regression produces reams and reams of numbers and figures that not everyone is particularly interested in, but this is a way of visualizing that regression. And really what it is doing here is drawing a line from the location of the place on the historic map to its relative location on a modern map. So where you see those much longer lines, that means there's something strange going on there in terms of how the place was positioned on the historic map itself. And these displacements themselves produce a first picture of Louth's survey through the map. So this is particularly evident where the vectors show pockets of sort of systematic displacement. So where you see those groups of sort of longer lines all bunched together, that starts to tell us something about what's going on with the survey process there as well, in terms of these sorts of separate missions or legs of the survey that also, when we look at documentary evidence, relate back to the survey as well. Now, this image just shows an enlarged portion of the map. You can see Dublin is over to the left-hand side here. County Down is to the right-hand side. Remember, this map is tipped on its side, so it maybe takes a minute just to get your head around this, but we're looking at that coastline between County Down and Dublin to the south. And what's interesting about this, and the displacements here in particular for us, is the curvature of the displacement. It's actually unique to this map because I've run an analysis like this on a lot of different maps from the same time period. And what's happening here is the vectors are actually forming an arc over this region, beginning with those vectors in the north. They're pointing south and they're pointing slightly west, and then ending with the vectors in the south. In Meath and Dublin, they're pointing due east eventually. And what this does is it offers us insight into the survey practice used by Live. It's telling us really that there's a great likelihood, first of all, that measurement was made, because we see these systematic displacement bunches. They're a similar direction, they're a similar length. They correspond with these known survey legs. In this particular snippet here, this was actually one mission between late 1568 and mid 1569, when we know that Live was travelling south towards Dublin. And really what's happening here is that the vectors are emulating Live's movement south. So we're seeing evidence similar to this in other parts of the island as well, you know, as he moved between place A and place B, and sometimes back again in what you would call a closed traverse. But the vectors here are really simulating the directional path, the movement of the surveyor through the landscape. Now, considering that the time frame of the survey as well, Live is most likely to have used traverse or triangulation methodologies, perhaps a mix of both. With the traverse, the surveyor might have used, for instance, a cross staff, might have measured angles, distances from place to place as he moved across the survey area. And although a traverse is prone to error, typically this process would have followed known paths, so rivers and roads. And actually we see evidence of this in the map as well. So we see more of these systematic displacements, this example on screen being around the River Suir at Waterford. And again, these displacements along rivers on the map have this similar direction, orientation and length. Now, for triangulation, of course, a more detailed knowledge of mathematics was necessary. The surveyor would have needed the know-how, the tools, the manpower, especially in terms of drawing a baseline, something which, of course, we see later with the Ordnance Survey on the island. But for both methods, distance might have been measured with a rope, a chain, a pole, but in Live's case, considering the distance he was travelling and how speedily actually he completed the survey, it's most likely to conclude that he measured by foot or by legs on horseback, hence this traverse methodology that we're witnessing here in the displacements being more likely. And to learn a little bit more, to delve a bit deeper as well, we can look more closely at some of these sort of specific localized bunches of displacement. This particular point here is from County Down, just so you can situate yourselves. You can see Strangford Castle there, St John's Point. Remember, again, it is tipped on its side, so north is over to the right-hand side. And this particular part was probably completed in one leg, but in two parts. So here we have basically the coastline, the displacement vectors indicating that the coastline is being stretched or elongated between this point and Dublin, which is further south. And the errors again here are indicating, because they're systematic in length and direction, they're indicating that measurement was used, and that measurement for this group of places, as I said, was probably taken in two legs. So you can note that the places which are further north, so we have Walshastown Castle, Audley's Castle, Strangford Castle, and Portaferry Castle, you can see the direction and the length of those displacements is very slightly different to the others just next to that, which include St John's Point and Ardglass, for instance. And it is in the compilation and the drafting process of the map that this error, this length of the displacement was most likely introduced. So in essence, when the map was drawn, the distance between this group of places and the group of places further to the south it was actually separated too far. This is probably an overestimation of the area around the Mourne Mountains that we're seeing here. And with the same group of places, we can move on to look at another aspect of the survey, and that's observation. So of course, thanks to the geology of County Down, I'm sure many of you will know there are no shortage of vantage points with the drumlins in particular, and of course the Mourne Mountains as well. But there's also present many churches, castles, towers, etc., that would have provided the necessary height to make observations and to conduct a radial survey as part of this work. And on one of the places, Castle Bright, as you can see here, is situated in the very centre of these groups of places that I showed on the previous screen. And it has views in most directions. Bright, in fact, was actually used as one of the trigonometrical survey points by the 19th century OS as well. Now, due to the current condition of the castle, it can't be ascended, but we do know what height it would have been when it was intact. And we can actually produce a model within the GIS based on these calculations. So in other words, we can imagine Lythe standing at the top of the castle and imagining what he could actually observe from that vantage point. And this is something that's called linear line of sight analysis. But here you can see it's really mixing the location, so where these places are, with digital elevation as well. So we're able to assess this observation from one point to another. And all combinations of places were tested for line of sight here. You can see Castle Bright is marked with the blue circle. And the white lines that come out from Castle Bright, they show the places that could be observed from the top of that castle itself. So Lythe could have seen St John's Point to the south, Castle Screen up to his northwest, places like Bishop's Corp and Dunsford and Caliph to the northeast as well. Now the four places to the very top that include Walshestown Castle, Strangford and Portaferry, they could not be observed. So again, that points to the fact that those four places were most likely part of their own sort of mini survey. And of course, there were other vantage points around this area as well. Here you can see the view that Lythe might have had from the Mourne Mountains. Actually, this is from Millstone Mountain in the Mournes, looking north towards those places. And it gives you a better idea of how elevation can affect this observation process here as well. Now, the second map that I just want to touch on briefly then today relates to these confiscated counties that Keith was mentioning earlier, in particular the maps of Bodley and his team. So these were surveyed at the end of the first decade of the 17th century, so about 40 years or so after Lythe. And they detail these lands that were confiscated in Ulster after the flight of the Earls. So as mentioned earlier, these maps, along with the earlier Bartlett maps of Ulster, these are extant at the National Archives in Kew, the originals, but of course we have these reproduced copies by the Ordnance Survey themselves, one copy of which of course you can look at in Armagh Robinson as well. And it's really these barony maps that I'm most interested in thinking about today, and Keith and I have been thinking through over several years now as well. As with Lythe, the correspondence, it provides some detail on the survey, but again, not all that much information on the field practices. So we know, for instance, that Bodley had several other men involved in surveying and plotting. We know that they carried out the survey over 67 days, so it was really speedy surveying, similar to Lythe. They covered a lot of ground in very little time. But we don't really know very much about the skill or the training of Bodley and his team. But of course, theodolites, plane tables, chains for measuring, triangulation, for calculating angles and bearings, all of these things were by this time part of the surveyor and a cartographer's toolkit, but we just can't know whether they used them or not. And Annalee Margie, in her study of the map, suggests that the instrumentation for the survey would have been rudimentary. Andrews agrees with this again in saying that he didn't feel that the maps were any more correct than what might have been produced just from verbal data, and saw them really as not a true survey. So Keith and I were very keen to sort of dig behind the map a little more to see what other information we could get from them. And the reason being is that They have, yes, a lot of information. We have topographical features, military outposts and things like that included on the barony maps, but also they are the first visualization of Ireland's baronies, and more importantly to us in terms of linking with the Ordnance Survey information, is that they are the first cartographic image of townlands in Ireland as well. So all of these little tiny boundaries that you can see here are all of the townlands that make up, in this case, part of the barony of Strabane. So to illustrate how we might use some of the similar techniques that I've just shown you with Live, but for Budley instead, we've just selected one barony or one map. This is part of the barony of Lochinchelin. And you can see it's located up here just to the northwest of Lough Neagh on the modern map there. And again, a similar process to Live, that we collect the place name information first of all, we collect the coordinate information as well. It's a little different in the sense that places aren't marked with points like they would be on the Live map. Instead, we're working actually with polygons instead. But other than that, essentially, it's the same process. But where it does get a lot more complex is actually trying to match the historic map townlands with modern map townlands. And when I say modern map townlands, I mean the townlands that we know today that are derived from that first Ordnance Survey of Ireland. And we used very heavily in this, the Northern Ireland Place Names Project and their database. Of course, they list all of these place names, the sources where they appeared, and that change over time. And that's really what we needed in terms of sort of this place matching process that we were working through here. And really using this place matching and the associated coordinate information, performing the same sort of displacement analysis again on screen, you can see a visualization of this. So as with the Live example I showed you earlier, each of these lines are overlaid on the historic map, and they're drawing a line from the townland where it is on the historic map to its relative location on a modern map. So it can give us an idea of what kind of picture this is in comparison to the Ordnance Survey maps themselves. And if I can draw your attention just to the map down in the bottom right, first of all, most notable really on this is that in the most southerly tip of this barony in Lochinchelin, you can see that we have these really long systematic displacement vectors, and they're pointing to the north and to the east. And this is telling us that actually on the Budley maps, these townlands were located too far to the south and to the west. And then when we look in the north and east, the displacement vectors are generally a lot smaller. They have a shorter length, and they're not necessarily systematic in the same way. So they show a stronger likeness with the positioning of the townlands between the Budley map and the Ordnance Survey townlands. And you'll also note that there are some really random errors in here as well. They don't appear to have any obvious pattern, and they're pointing in all strange directions. This is most likely because they were completely misplaced when Budley was actually working on this, or his team were working on this. Probably some sort of inaccurate field collection or information, or it could even have been at the point when the maps were being drawn after the field practice. So why are we seeing these patterns then? Keith and I, we wanted to go a little bit further than this and explore obviously the reasons behind this, try to interpret what we were seeing in the displacement vectors. And one of the possible reasons for this is delving deeper into the topography and how that might have actually played a role in this survey. So here in this image on screen, you can see these townland boundaries actually overlaid on a digital terrain model. And this particular barony, you can see straight away, is surrounded by elevated terrain to the west and to the south. So we've got the Sperrins to the west and Slieve Gallion to the south. So we might begin to ask here exactly how much or if elevation is maybe responsible for the inaccuracies that we have seen in those displacement vectors. And we can do this through another piece of maths, I'm afraid, but I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but it's something called geographically weighted regression. What it basically allows us to do is to plug lots of different variables into a spatial model to assess the relationship. And what we asked the computer to do here was to look at the relationship between the length of those displacements that I showed you earlier and elevation. And what this tells us is that where you see the longer displacements, you're going to get a greater elevation. So straight away, it's telling us there's some sort of positive correlation between elevation and inaccuracies in the map. But it also reveals that the correlation isn't true for the whole map. It only accounts for about half of the story. So there are lots of other things that are going on there. And Keith and I have been exploring what those could have been. So we started to divide the barony up into smaller portions and do tests on different types. We looked around the edges, we looked at the north, at the south, different proportions, different aspects of the map. For instance, it revealed that that southern portion of the map that we've already discussed, it didn't only have the greatest displacement, but also the greatest rotation as well. So that part of the map is actually rotated 40 degrees counterclockwise, much greater distortion than you see on any other portion of the map. And those townlands in the north, they were more akin to modern map in terms of the placement or the siting of the townlands. Thinking about interpreting that most likely because that as a place was deemed a safer space for surveyors. They had garrisons there for protection. Remember, these are military in Ireland, but also low-lying land that might have been just simply more straightforward to survey on foot, and possibly also a space that they would have concentrated more on because actually it was better land, it was more fertile land, and therefore they were instructed to pay more attention to the measurements in that space as well. What this can't tell us, though, are things about, for instance, the weather and the visibility. This is also, of course, linked with elevation, but also the hostility at the time in the area, the level and veracity of local assistance, because these teams employed local guides to assist them as well. Also, the surveyors involved, we know there were quite a few of them, but did they have varying ability, skill, use different methods, for instance, maybe even different units of measurement? And this is something that really Keith and I are keen to explore into the future by looking at more of the 28 maps that are actually within this whole collection. So Keith, I'll pass back over to you now.
Thanks very much, Kat.
Okay.
Great. So I'm going to then sort of draw things more towards a close and end point. So we started off with these maps of the Escheated Counties. We started off with thinking about the Ordnance Survey of Henry James, and Kat has taken us through something of what these maps can tell us about what lies behind them in the field, from Lythe to Bodley and so on. Next slide, please. Sorry, Kat. Just to kind of take things further forward and think again about the Ordnance Survey then in the 19th century, a little step before James, back to the day of Colby, we do of course have the Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps of Ireland. There's a nice set of them in the Robinson Library, and there's also a very nice set, as you can see here, at the Queen's University Map Library in the Geography building at Queen's in those very, very fine volumes. So the Ordnance Survey 200, the OS 200 Bicentenary project I mentioned at the start, is focusing on these maps as part of a broader project. If you go to the next slide, please. A broader project, which kind of ties together with some of the things that Kat has just been talking about on the townlands, and the way in which we might begin to create or recreate really a body of material relating to the Ordnance Survey, the early Ordnance Survey on the island of Islands, and thinking about not just the maps, which, you know, of course are really important to us as legacies from the 1830s, 1840s through the Ordnance Survey, but the other kinds of materials that the Ordnance Survey were producing, the memoirs, letters and name books, and bringing these things, these different sources together and connecting them again, linking back to what Kat was just been saying as well, linking them digitally. So to use 21st century digital technologies, in this case, to help us understand how the Ordnance Survey operated on the grounds, and to draw out from the texts and from the maps something of those activities of the surveyors in the field. So that's what Ordnance Survey 200 will be doing. If you move on to the next slide, we're drawing together, we've called it a digital corpus here, and the aim, the aspiration in 2024, bearing in mind, of course, that is the bicentennial of the Ordnance Survey on the island of Ireland, we will be, with our partners, producing an online platform which integrates these different sources, working with the Royal Irish Academy, Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, University of Limerick, and the Digital Repository of Ireland, and many others as well, connecting these different sources and enabling us to dig more deeply through these sources to take us back into the field. Next slide, please. And one thing which we've begun to do already through our GIS researcher at Queen's, which is Rebecca Milligan. Rebecca's been very busy in the map library in the Elmwood building, photographing our first edition maps, because what we're interested in is the marginalia around the maps. These record for us the activities of the named individuals here, the engineers, the Royal Engineers, the surveyors on the ground. And what we can begin to do is put all this information into a database using the same sorts of technologies that Kat was just talking about through geographic information systems, and begin to actually mine the maps, extract that information and visualize it in a map form, to create a map from the map, if you like, and to think about what is a map's biography, what does a map tell us about who produced it and where they were and how they traveled around the island. Next slide, please. I'll move it through quickly. So this is hot off the press. This is exciting stuff as far as we're concerned, and I hope you think so too. So this is based upon that extraction of information from those map sheets, thanks to Rebecca's diligence. Kat has visualized these two maps here. The one on the left-hand side focuses on those named captains on the sheets, which you can see different colors representing different individuals or groups of individuals. And what we're interested in here is the geographies of where those individuals are operating or were operating in the 1830s, as they were mapping through from 1830s to the 1840s, mapping through Ireland from north to south, which you can see on the right-hand side, because the maps also include, of course, a survey date. So we can begin to now visualize that process, that pattern of field survey from the north, slowly working their way south down to the southern tip of Ireland by 1842. So actually digging into the map digitally, using GIS to visualize this information can help us to go back to the field, to take ourselves from the map back into the field, and to think about those field practices that underpin the maps which interest us. Next slide, please. So to conclude very briefly then, so what we've been doing here is taking our journey through maps, which I hope you enjoy this evening. Chronologically, we've been traversing the landscape. We've been taking in different parts of the island, but especially parts of the northeast of Ireland, thinking about how we can use digital and spatial technologies to explore our sites of survey, thinking about those survey practices, which are so important, but often overlooked in modern histories of maps and map making, as I said at the start, and thinking through how the map making process, how the field, makes an impact on the map making process, but also to think about the map making process having an impact on the field. It's something else we've not really talked about this evening, but map making itself leaves a trace in the landscape. There's an archaeology of cartography to be explored, if you like. So anyway, we end on two projects there, mapping monuments and two websites, and OS 200 for those who are interested. This has been recorded. So if you're interested, please do follow us on Twitter. There's our handle there, Ireland Mapped. Thanks very much to Kat for a brilliant talk. Really enjoyed that. Thank you. And thank you very much, everybody, for listening.